Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. In March 2025, General Douglas MacArthur's iconic cap won the Virginia Association of Museums People's Choice Award as an important artifact deserving conservation. Inspired by this designation, the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, a 501c3 dedicated to supporting the MacArthur Memorial, launched a global fundraising campaign to preserve this iconic piece of history. Thanks to the incredible generosity of donors worldwide, we were able to move forward with this project in July 2025. Many of you donated to this project or simply followed the story, and I'm delighted to share that the conservation work is complete and the cap is back on display at the museum. And as a bonus today, I'm sitting down with the conservator for this project, Howard Sutcliffe, principal conservator and director of River Region Costume and Textile Conservation, to discuss the conservation of this historic treasure. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So why don't you start off by telling us how you got involved in conservation work?
Sure. So my undergraduate degree was in textile design. And as you can maybe tell from my accent, I'm not originally from Alabama or Nashville, Tennessee. So I grew up in the UK and I went to school in Scotland and Canada. And I graduated with a degree in constructed textiles from Duncan of Jordanstone College, and I was 21, so not really, qualified to do much at that point or make, big life decisions. But as part of the degree, in the UK, you have to write a dissertation to get the honours designation. And so I looked into the state of contemporary tapestry weaving in the UK at that time. And that kind of led me into the history of tapestry weaving and down to Hampton Court Palace, which houses Henry VIII's collection. And at that time, the palace also housed the Textile Conservation Centre, the Embroiderers Guild, and the Historic Royal Palace's Textile Conservation Centre. And so I got really interested in conservation. It was a nice blend of both the arts and sciences. And it was interesting, but I felt it was also a good path forward without having to rely on people liking the work that I make for a living. So that was that really, and it was it's certainly been an interesting career since then.
I bet. So, what are some of the top historical objects you've worked on that you can tell us about?
Oh, I know. Yeah, people I have to sign NDAs more and more often these days. But really, when I was at school, I hated working on costume. I really didn't like it at all. And then I ended up going to, I did a Mellon Fellowship, a 3-year Mellon Fellowship at Philadelphia Museum of Arts. And I pretty much purely worked on costume there. And we were preparing a big exhibition on the work of Elsa Schiaparelli, who was a contemporary of Chanel, kind of like working in the late 20s through to the, World War II era. And I just kind of like grew to love it. And so there was a lot of great pieces in the Schiaparelli show that, it's always interesting when kind of like an object is kind of like tied to a person, like the MacArthur hat. But so there was pieces there that, belonged to Wallace Simpson, Schiaparelli designed for movies as well. So Zsa Zsa Gabor and kind of Mae West and all of these crazy things. But I've worked on some really, really interesting objects kind of that are, pretty iconic, also from Virginia. John Marshall's Supreme Court robes from the Marshall House in Richmond, and obviously they were the first black silk robes that we're all familiar with today. Andrew Jackson's inaugural top hat from Tennessee State Museum, and a lot of stuff for Biltmore, Vanderbilt pieces, right the way through to one of my most recent projects was the first Orby mascot from Auburn University that dated to like 1979. So yeah, they run the gambit, but kind of like anything that's really kind of like tied to people and kind of it's always really interesting.
I bet they all tell such unique stories.
Definitely, definitely. And every project is different. So, there's never, really, unless you have kind of like a batch of, 50 related objects that are all fairly similar, then everything is pretty unique and has its own unique challenges. And so every day is kind of different.
How would you describe the condition of MacArthur's cap when you started working on it?
I think we generally rate things from like excellent to poor, and I think the cap was probably in the fair kind of region. It had some issues, but I mean nothing kind of like terribly major given the circumstances, and the life that the cap had, and considering he wore it pretty much constantly in Asia, kind of for, many years. I mean, anyone that's been to Japan or China in July, will know that it makes Florida look fairly temperate at that time of year. So there was a lot of, obviously what we call kind of like evidence of use of, and especially you find this with costume that is in such close proximity to a person. You have, a lot of sweat and things like that. So there was a lot of just evidence of use, damage through use, and then the combination of materials too in the cap had worked against it a little bit. And so you have a lot of leather with metals, which don't really mix that well. You have just kind of wear and tear. There's a lot of metal braid decoration that deteriorates, and metals in combination with kind of like silk and cotton don't do all that well. So there was a lot of stuff going on, but it was all fairly treatable, which is good.
So why don't you talk about the treatment then? Can you walk us through the process of stabilizing the cap and then kind of the techniques and materials that you use to preserve it?
Sure. So a big part of the treatment also, rather than, as the conservation of the actual cap, a big part of the treatment was kind of making a new mount for it. And so probably the scariest part of the treatment was removing the old mount that was just kind of like a little bit too big and kind of wedged in there. So it was a block of foam that I had to very carefully kind of carve down to get it out of the cap without causing any further damage. So once I had that out, I could really kind of like assess the situation of what was going on. So the worst part of the part of the cap that was in the worst condition was the lining, which was a silk satin. And obviously, that had been against, that had not been changed. That, was always part of the cap. And so it was in direct contact with his head. And so that was very deteriorated. And so with the silk satin, the weave structure is such that the warp is very, very fine, and then the weft threads are a lot thicker. The warp completely covers the weft. So there'd been a lot of damage and loss to the warps, revealing these thick weft threads, which were kind of sticking out all over the place. So the first thing was, the first thing really was just to kind of surface clean the whole cap. And by surface cleaning, we're talking, it's a fancy term for basically vacuuming, but we do it with a very fancy vacuum that has controllable suction. And so we're using it on a very low suction levels just to make sure that we don't do any damage. So the cap was surface cleaned, and then I humidified the interior using kind of like an ultrasonic humidifier, which is, a piece of kit that most people will probably be familiar with. We use them in, our homes to kind of raise the humidity level. But that gets attached to a little piece of kit called a preservation pencil, which allows for a very, very fine stream of steam to be directed at an object, and we can alter the temperature. So we don't have to have boiling steam. The steam can be kind of just warm, which is kind of nice. So that kind of helps to raise the water content of the fibers, and I was able to lay the weft threads down and get them all aligned. And then I used kind of a support fabric. It's a sheer fabric. It's a very, very fine nylon net that I get from a supplier in the UK that still makes it using 19th century machines. They, used to make silk stockings out of using these machines, but now they make this net. Nylon is great because you can dye it to kind of like any color to match, which happened in this case. So, I dyed it to match. I used a very thin strip just to tack down all of the weft threads. And then I made a template of the lining. And then I recreated the lining using the net as an overlay. And then I fit that into the cap very carefully. And then that got tacked into the interior to kind of support all of the damage and just hold everything in place. And then after that was done, I did some support work to the leather sweatband that was inside. That was deteriorating. There was cracks, there was holes. So the holes got infilled with Japanese tissue paper that was tinted to match and then secured in place using an adhesive. And then flipping to the exterior, I did a lot of work just kind of cleaning the metal thread decoration. It was really interesting kind of looking back at photos of General MacArthur wearing the hat, because even then the metal threads were quite darkened, and so I didn't want to clean them too much to kind of alter their appearance. I wanted them to look, how they did when he was wearing the hat. But there was a lot of dust and just grime in there, so I was able to kind of like remove that pretty successfully. And then there was just quite a bit of damage, just kind of like around the brim of the hat, kind of like with some of the silk braids that decorate it. And so it was really then going in and just adding kind of like, again, an overlay of this fine nylon net, just to kind of like hold all of that and support it and protect it going forward. So the little overlays are kind of like pinned in place, and then I stitched them down using kind of like tiny little curved needles that most people, when I show them, describe them as looking like eyelashes. And they're designed, they're actually a lot of materials that we use in conservation come from the medical field. And so the little needles are actually used for eye surgery. And then the threads that I use are a polyester thread that is pulled from polyester crepeline. So it's a super, super fine thread. So it's very kind of, exacting and precise work. And so I think that was pretty much kind of the bulk of the actual conservation work. And then I kind of like moved on to the mount. And so because kind of the cap has that big kind of, classic kind of floppy top, I had to make the mount in 2 pieces and actually 3 pieces. And so I made kind of a pad that fits into the top of the cap out of polyester batting. So kind of like people would probably be familiar with that material from kind of like quilts. It's the same sort of stuff that we use for kind of like padding quilts and things like that. So a couple of pieces of that was kind of like cut to shape, and then I covered it with a silk satin cover, and then I kind of quilted it where I needed it to be quilted to kind of like help recreate the shape of the cap. And once that was set in place, I then used an archival foam to make the main part of the mount that supports kind of like the brim and, where the head would be. And so we use this expanded polyester foam called ethafoam that is inert, and it comes in blocks and you can kind of carve it to shape. So then that got kind of like padded a little bit and then covered in fabric that matches the color of the hat. And in the base of that mount, I embedded a couple of washers. And then I made kind of a padded board for the mounted hat to sit on, because we wanted to keep the mounts kind of flexible, because you already have an existing mount in the case. So you may want to kind of, continue using that or use this board. But the board also provides, if the cap ever comes out for kind of scholars to look at, having it on this board enables them to kind of like handle the hat without actually touching the hat. So the board kind of it's kind of archival cards, several layers, a little bit of padding, and then it's covered in the fabric. But within it, I've embedded 2 magnets that correspond with the washers in the actual hat mounts, and so they kind of stick together when they need to. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, I mean, it's such an interesting mix of, like you said, science and art, just kind of the best way to do things, I think. Were there any surprises or unique discoveries about the cap during the process? Did it speak to you? Did it tell you a story in any way?
Well, I mean, certainly, and you find this with a lot of objects, certainly in museum collections, is that as well as dealing with condition issues that are inherent to the object caused by the materials that are used and things like that, and kind of like its use and things like that. You're also dealing with past interventions by other conservators or restorers. And certainly in the case of the cap, some things had been done to it previously. So somebody has lacquered the bill or re-lacquered it, I think. So kind of like looking at photos of the general wearing the hat, the metal thread decoration on the bill is not shiny, but it has now been kind of completely coated in kind of like almost like a plastic-like finish, which is kind of interesting. And then somebody had also, the metal thread decoration, the insignia on the front of the cap, someone had glued some of those metal threads down. And whatever glue that they had used had kind of caused more kind of copper corrosion to kind of like form. So there was kind of like a green corrosion products on the surface that I was able to kind of remove using kind of like a tiny little, toothpick type instrument, just kind of like gently chip away at the adhesive as much as possible to get that out of there. Yeah, I think kind of because, obviously I'd not seen the cap in person prior to, you coming over to the studio and delivering it. But you had sent a lot of photographs, which was great, and a lot of documentation. So there was no major kind of surprises really, which is good. I did kind of with the interior lining. I thought I was going to go about it in one way and ended up kind of, changing my mind and doing kind of like the template lining instead. So I mean, sometimes with conservation, you think you know what's going to work and it doesn't. And so you have to kind of, be pretty flexible and be able to pivot to something else.
Now, there's an ongoing question in the museum world as to how you balance preserving an artifact's historical authenticity with preserving it for the future. What are your thoughts on this?
So it is really interesting, and I think it's really dependent on perspective. And so, conservation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not just me kind of making decisions. It's kind of like me in consultation with, a whole bunch of other people, kind of, in your case with you and Corey, the curator, and talking things through. Generally, it'll involve, curators and, scientists sometimes, map makers, all of these people are involved in the decision making and, what would happen in an art museum is sometimes different to what would happen in kind of like a history museum or to, for a private client. So it really depends on kind of like the perspective of who wants the conservation work doing. But I think balance is kind of the right word to use. We're always kind of, we're trying to preserve. The real thing of conservation is preserving what's left rather than making something look new. So it's the conservation restoration kind of conundrum. So as a conservator, I'm just really kind of like preserving it as is, just to make sure that it is going to survive for the next, 100 years. So it's taking kind of like, a light touch and trying not to alter things too much whilst preserving, as much information about the cap, original information about the cap as possible. So obviously in the case of this, we just talked about retaining kind of, the sweat stains and all the evidence of its use, by the general, but then also removing kind of, the past interventions, the adhesives that someone had put on there. And sometimes, things are what they are. Kind of, decisions were made, back in the day. I mean, conservation is always kind of like moving forward. There's always new materials, there's new techniques. Probably whoever did kind of the lacquering of the bill thought that they were doing, a great service to the cap for its, onward preservation. But, that completely changed the character of that part of the objects. Certainly I've been doing this long enough now that, some treatments that I've done over the years have, come up for kind of reevaluation and have been redone in institutions that I've worked at. So it's always, you're always reminded of how old you are, and
we do our best.
Exactly.
Do our best with with the best information we have at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I was absolutely delighted to see. I mean, it looks amazing, but obviously you still have, like you said, the sweat stains or maybe a little bit of hair gel stains. So for people that view the cap in the museum, you're seeing it better preserved to the best of our knowledge today, but it still has that worn character, and those sweat stains that people will be able to see.
Yeah.
So what do you hope visitors will take away when they see the cap on display? And just knowing the care that went into stabilizing it for future display.
Sure. I think kind of, hopefully they don't take too much away, because the whole point of conservation is them not noticing that, a lot has happened to it, even though it has, because they probably won't see, much of the new mount at all and things like that. So, even though a lot of work went into it, a lot of it, should remain fairly invisible to the casual observer. But, someone that's kind of studied the hats, will hopefully be able to tell kind of like quite a big difference that it's tidied up and it's supported, and it just looks kind of like a lot happier now, I think.
Well, we are very grateful for all of your work on this project. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about the conservation project.
No problem. It was a fun project to work on.
Well, we look forward to working with you on future projects as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov, or find us on X at MacArthur1880, or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.